Oh, good evening, everyone, for all three of us who are here so far. I hope other people will be coming in along the way, but welcome to week number 7 of PPA 500. And so we are just about done with our time together. I'm pretty sure we can get through everything tonight. So tonight will end up being our final Zoom session for this course. Then next week, we'll just reserve the time next week instead of a Zoom session. We will afford that time to you for doing your final assessment, finishing up your final assessment. So hopefully everything will then be done tonight. At the end of our discussion tonight, you'll have all the information that you need to then go and do a good job on this final assessment, the final assessment that we looked at the beginning of class last week. So that's where we currently are. If you have not yet submitted your Canvas essay number 5 and responses to classmates, please do make sure to do that by midnight tonight. That's the due date for that. And then your final assessment will be due by midnight next Tuesday. So again, this will be our last live Zoom session tonight. Then next week, instead of a live Zoom session, we will just give you the time to finish up working on your final assessment. As you are working on that final assessment, so next week, next Tuesday, it's due by midnight. I will be available. I'll be in front of my computer at 4 o'clock. And so if you do have any questions, you can always send me an email and I'll be ready to respond immediately to any questions you have. Hopefully by next Tuesday, though, you'll have the vast majority of the final assessment done. You can always turn the final assessment in early. You do not have to wait until midnight next Tuesday. If you get it done earlier than that, by all means, please feel free to go ahead and submit it. The sooner it comes in, the sooner I will be able to grade it. Then what I will do is I'll spend next Wednesday, the 13th, I believe that date is, going through all the final assessments, wrapping up all the final grades. And then within like 24 to 48 hours, I should have your final grades all ready to go. One thing I will warn you about, though, is sometimes it takes the university a beat to figure out that we are a hybrid course. And so sometimes they don't open up the grade roster for me right away. So I may have to remind them. So if you don't see your grade pop up there by next Thursday, don't panic. It just means the university hasn't caught up with us yet. But then as soon as they do open up the grade roster, I will go ahead and input our final grades. So where we are now is tonight we are going to finish up our material in terms of the functions of public administration. And last week we started the discussion by talking about the evolution of public employment. And I walked you through those eras of public employment. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention to the specific types of things that we do as public administrators as we manage our human resources. We'll do that in the first hour or so of class. And then the remainder of the class, we will spend talking about how we manage fiscal resources. And I'll introduce you to ideas about what a budget is, different types of budgets, different budget formats, where revenue tends to come from. And we'll talk about all those management of fiscal resources issues in the second part of class tonight. At the very end of class, I then have a couple slides that I'll share with you that talk about some of the future trends, some of the future challenges and future opportunities that we anticipate we will have in public administration over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And I think that should probably button everything up and put a nice little bow on everything that we have talked about so far this semester. So last week, we talked about, just to recap very quickly, we talked about the evolution of public employment. And we talked about the types of people who worked in government from the late 1700s into the 1820s during this era of gentlemen. We were hiring people based upon who they were, and primarily to add legitimacy to this fledgling national government, especially after the War of 1812 and the burning of the Capitol in 1814. Serious concerns about just how legitimate this new national government was and how likely it was that this government would continue. So we hired these quote unquote gentlemen because they provided that legitimacy to the national bureaucracy. Then we talked about the Jackson election, Andrew Jackson's election in 1828. And when Jackson comes into the White House, he ushers in this next era of employment known as the era of spoils, where you got your job not based upon who you were, but rather based upon who you knew. and you got your position based upon which political party you supported, which candidate you supported. As we said, to the victor go the spoils. Then we talked about the triggering event, which was the assassination of President Garfield in 1881, which then led to the Pendleton Act in 1883, which then led to this transition into the era of merit, where we started hiring people based upon not who they were, not who they knew, but rather based upon what they knew. And we were hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, based upon their expertise and their ability to do the jobs. We then talked about in the 1970s how we had this huge reform to civil service, where we completely changed the civil service system with the creation of all these different agencies that we had talked about last week, and how our current system of public employment is kind of this hybrid system in which the vast majority of our employees are career civil servants, but the people at the very top levels of our agencies and departments are political appointees. Then, to bridge this gap between those political appointees at the top of the organization and all these career civil servants throughout the remainder of the organization, we created this senior executive service. And the senior executive service was created to kind of bridge that gap between political appointees and career civil servants. So today we kind of have a hybrid system, but our system is very much dominated by the presence of career civil servants. We said in career civil service, we have this position classification type of approach where we will classify our positions into, at the federal level, what's called the general schedule. We walk through the general schedule and what the different grade levels were in the general schedule. We talked about some of the advantages versus the disadvantages of a position classification system like the general schedule. Primary advantage is you are paying people based upon the jobs that they are doing. And so it's supposed to be a more fair, a more equitable way of compensating civil servants. We said the disadvantage of a position classification system is that it really kind of boxes you in that you will have a cap, a top level to the pay band that you are in. So if you're in a GS11 position, then once you've been in that position 20 years or so, you're going to max out then. And so the only increases you'll be able to get will be cost of living increases if Congress feels disposed to provide you with those cost of living increases. The only other way that you can increase your compensation is to get your position reclassified. And we said last week that sometimes a very painful and difficult process. You would have to apply for a reclassification study and then see if the substance of your job has changed so much that it would warrant reclassifying your position from that GS11 into perhaps a GS12 position, which would then carry with it higher remuneration. So there are advantages and disadvantages this type of classification system. The general schedule is a system used at the federal level, but the vast majority of states also have their own position classification systems as well. So he said in a career civil service system, public administrators have these protections that come to them from government code because of the career civil service system. They are protected from arbitrary, capricious dismissal and sanctioning. They are protected from the influence of politics. But in addition to that, you overlay some of these protections that also come out of the collective bargaining process. And through the collective bargaining process, we have the creation of this collective bargaining agreement, this contract, and this contract then bestows other protections upon the members or the people who are represented by that bargaining unit, that are represented on under that collective bargaining agreement. You do not have to be a member of the public employee union in order to be protected by this collective bargaining agreement. Everyone within that bargaining unit will all be protected by the collective bargaining agreement. We also talked about what happens when we have a situation where we have an impasse, where management and where the union cannot come to an agreement. We talked through fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration, and how those three impasse resolution procedures work. And then we also acknowledge that in the public sector, it's far more likely for people to be unionized than it is in the private sector, about 3 times as likely that in the public sector, you will be part of a public sector employee union. So the upshot of all this is that when we manage our human resources, we have to be very mindful of not only career civil service protections, but we also have to be very mindful of the protections that are bestowed upon employees by the contract, by the collective bargaining agreement. And so what this has meant is meant that it's a very complex situation to manage human resources in the public sector. So much so that many agencies have started to centralize the managing human resources function into human resource offices. So they are allowing human resource professionals to be in charge of managing these human relationships, more so than just line managers. And what that has meant is meant that in some respects, line managers have kind of lost some control over the management of their people who are in the below them, their subordinates. But the good part of it is that it has meant that there is kind of a whole cottage industry that has really risen up in terms of the hiring of human resource professionals. Now, if you're very interested in being a human resource professional, you like the information we covered last week and the information we're going to cover this week, then you go on to 577 Human Resource Management and you enjoy that information. There is a certificate in our program, Employee Employer Relations. You can get a certificate specifically in employer relations. And the core course that you would take in that certificate program is PPA 575 Employee Employer Relations. And in that course, you'll get into a lot of the details in terms of all the specific things you do in managing human resources. But last week was just kind of there to set the stage for us. And then this week, moving into a more specific discussion of the types of things that we do as we manage human resources. I think we had mentioned last week that about 85 to 90% of most public agency budgets will be made up of the human resource management function. About 85 to 90% of your budget will go towards salaries and benefits and professional development. And so if 85 to 90% of your budget is being geared toward this function, obviously it tells us very clearly that this is a very important function of public administration. That's why we have a standalone core course, PPA 577, where you'll learn a lot of these skills in kind of granular detail. Tonight, all we really want to do is just kind of present to you, here are the different functions, or here are the different steps you go through in managing human resources, and then talk about a few specifics in each one, but just kind of whet your appetite then for your 577 course, where you'll get into much more detail in all these different functions and all these activities that you will do. So obviously, the first step in the management of human resources is the recruitment phase. We have to recruit people who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the jobs within our organization. Here, there are great differences between recruitment in the private sector versus recruitment in the public sector. One of those primary differences is in terms of how targeted our recruitment tends to be in the public sector. So, in the public sector, we have talked several times about the values that underpin public administration: effectiveness, efficiency, social equity and justice, political responsiveness, protection of individual rights, representative bureaucracy. And so, since social equity and representative bureaucracy, as well as the protection of individual rights, are such important values in the public sector, we want to create as diverse a workforce as we possibly can. We really want our public workforce to represent the populations that workforce is serving. And so we get involved in targeted recruitment, where we will target our recruitment efforts to try and diversify our labor pools, which will then help us diversify our workforces. I made a slight change to this slide and just included for you some specifics about some of the different targeted sources that we can reach out to in the public sector in order to try and diversify our workforce. Sources such as the Local Government Hispanic Network, the American Society for Public Administration Section for Women in Public Administration, the National Forum of Black Public Administrators. These are just some examples of some targeted recruitment sources that you can reach out to in order to try and recruit as diversified an applicant pool as you can possibly get. I think I mentioned to you earlier, just as an example, whenever we hire here, when I was department chair, we hired two new full-time faculty members. I don't know when that's going to ever happen again, but we had the ability to hire two full-time faculty members. And when we did it, we engaged in targeted recruitment. So we put our position, our announcement vacancy announcement together. That then had to be vetted through our Office of Equity and Diversity. We then had to create a recruitment plan. And in that recruitment plan, we had to list, here are all the different places where we are going to advertise this position. So some of the places are kind of general, such as publicsectorcareers.org, which is kind of the one central clearinghouse for public sector jobs. Also, Chronicle of Higher Education, we would advertise in. higheredjobs.com is another one. But then we would advertise in these targeted sources as well. We'd advertise directly with the Section for Women in Public Administration, advertise directly through this national forum for Black public administrators. And again, by getting those advertisements out to those targeted sources, you have a much better chance of diversifying your applicant pool. In addition to that, I would write letters to PhD programs that were well known for providing, awarding degrees to underrepresented populations. And so I had a whole list of PhD programs that I would then send out personalized letters to recruit the graduates from those programs. All that was part of a targeted recruitment strategy that then had to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So I think, as we had talked about before, then once you send out these advertisements, then the applications start rolling in. Then your applicant pool would then have to again be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. And then as you go through your applicant pool and you select your semifinalists for Zoom or phone interviews, those semifinalist pool would then also have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then once you select your three finalists to bring on site for an interview, then that final pool would also then have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So as you can see, we work very hard and we try very hard in order to try and diversify our workforce as much as we possibly can. That means that our recruitment process in the public sector is probably going to be a lot more complex, and it's also going to take a lot longer than what we would normally see in the private sector. There are a lot more steps that we're going to go through. So whereas a recruitment might take 1 day in the private sector, it's probably going to take 3, 6, 9 months in the public sector. The way in which we would do it is we would have our advertisement going out in July. We would then review applications usually in September or October. We would put together a list of semifinalists by the end of the year. We would then have a list of 3 finalists to bring to campus, usually by early February. We would then extend an offer at the beginning of March. So the process would run from July 1st until the first week in March, where we would hopefully get a candidate who accepted the offer. So it is a very protracted process, but it is protracted for a very good reason. So there are some really serious differences between recruitment in the public versus the private sector. You'll talk more about those differences in 577. Then once you have your applicant pool that has been approved for the Office of Equity and Diversity, then you have to go about your selection process. And that's your second step, if you will, in the management of human resources. Historically, at the federal level, selection was very much dominated by an examination process. And the old exams that were used at the federal level were referred to as the PACE exams, P-A-C-E, the PACE exams. So what would happen is the Office of Personnel Management would create the PACE exam for this position. Then the Office of Personnel Management would then administer the exams. They would then score the examinations. They would create a list of 3 eligible candidates based upon their scores on the exams. And then that eligibility list would then be provided to the hiring agency. And the hiring agency could only interview and then hire off of that eligibility list. Frequently, what OPM would do is they would also add on what's called a veteran's preference. And so if an applicant is a veteran of the military service, they would add on a certain number of points in veterans preference onto their final score on the examination, again, to try and diversify the workforce a bit more and get more veterans into the federal workforce. So it's a very top-down centralized process for selection. As we mentioned last week, it's no longer as centralized as it used to be. And so now, instead of using examinations, agencies have the ability to do a more holistic examination of knowledge, skills, and abilities. So agencies will look at the resumes of those applicants. They'll look at their education. They'll look at their experience. They'll review their letters of reference, their recommendations, and kind of do a much broader, more holistic review of an individual's KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And today, at least at the federal level, there's a lot more discretion that's provided to the hiring agency. And the hiring agency doesn't necessarily have to run everything through the Office of Personnel Management. So we've kind of moved away from examinations at the federal level. Depending upon the position you apply for, they may still be an examination. If you're at the state level, depending on the position, there may be an examination. If it's a more technical position, there probably increases the likelihood of having to sit for an examination. But one of the problems that we found with examinations, one of the reasons why we moved away from them, is that examinations were not really good predictors of performance on the job. And also, those examinations oftentimes had some implicit bias, cultural bias that were built into them as well. So, not to get too far afield into this discussion, we'll talk more about it in 577, but when we look at how well the examination reflects the job, we are talking about this concept of validity. So there's a very famous case back in the 1970s called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. And in the Griggs case, the courts established this idea of what was called content validity. What had happened in that case is that they were hiring for positions that were essentially janitorial, custodial types of positions, but the examinations had math questions on there that really didn't have anything to do with the content of the job. So to have content validity in a job examination, the content of the exam must closely align with the content of what's being done on the job on a daily basis. If the exam matches the content of the job, you have what is called content validity. But a lot of our examinations that we were using in the 70s and 80s simply did not have that content validity. Another type of validity is what's called predictive validity. Predictive validity says that performance on the exam will strongly correlate with and predict performance on the job. So people who perform well on the exam should then perform well on the job. And there should be that strong correlation. That's called predictive validity. Then there's another type of validity known as criterion validity. Sometimes we refer to it as concurrent validity. So it goes by a couple different terms, but criterion or concurrent validity, if I could type. In concurrent validity, what we will do is we will take people who are already on the job and we'll look at those who are performing very well. We'll then give them an examination. We'll look at people who are performing poorly and then give them an examination as well. In theory, people who are performing well on the job should then also perform well on the exam. It's kind of a concurrent approach because you're taking existing employees and then giving them the exam rather than hiring people based upon how they performed on the exam, as you would do in a predictive validity type of approach. But it is difficult to design examinations that are valid and that do not contain cultural bias. So much so that we have moved away from over-reliance upon these examinations. Another approach that some agencies will use in the public sector is what's called assessment centers. So they will create this assessment center. An assessment center is essentially a simulated work environment. So perhaps on a Saturday morning, you will create a simulated work environment and you'll then bring your candidates into that simulated work environment and you will then monitor and evaluate their performance. The idea is you can see how they perform in this assessment center doing the same type of work they're going to be doing once they are hired into the job. Obviously, as Elton Mayo told us, there is the Hawthorne effect. And so anytime you watch someone, anytime you observe someone, there is a high probability that they are going to behave differently. So people who want the job are obviously going to work a lot harder and try and be more productive in these assessment centers than perhaps their productivity level once they are hired into the job. So there's a problem with validity sometimes with these assessment centers. Also, there's a problem with costs. Assessment centers are very costly. They'll cost you money, they'll cost you time, they'll cost you effort. There are opportunity costs that are associated with creating these assessment centers. So they're very costly types of endeavors as well. But it's a way in which you can have people kind of do the work that they're going to be doing on a daily basis. But our goal obviously is to select a diverse workforce of applicants who are well suited to do the job and to be productive once they are hired into the organization. Once someone is hired into the organization, then you move into a third phase, which is allocation and evaluation. So here, once you have onboarded them into the organization, you kind of provided them with that, introduction, that orientation to the organization. You need to decide who does what within the organization. You need to understand what types of jobs and what types of tasks they will be doing on a daily basis. So in this third phase of human resource management, we have some discrete strategies that we will use in order to try and determine what type of work is being done in each job. Because again, if we're a bureaucratic organization, we are predicated on this idea of division of labor and specialization of tasks. So one of the strategies that we'll use is to conduct what's called a job analysis. A job analysis is when we take every position in the organization and we deconstruct those positions into their component elements. So we take a position, we ask the question, what is the incumbent doing on a daily basis? What types of tasks are they doing? And then what percentage of their time will be devoted to each one of these tasks? So what you oftentimes do in a job analysis is you'll provide a survey to the incumbent in the job, asking that person, what are you doing on a daily basis? How much time do you devote to each one of these activities? Then oftentimes your HR office will then send someone out to shadow this person, this incumbent, to confirm what the incumbent reported in that survey. But the job analysis, we are taking each position individually in isolation and deconstructing it into its component parts. Here are the tasks. Here's the amount of time spent on each one of those tasks. So that's the foundational place where you start, is with a job analysis. Once you have conducted a job analysis of each position within your organization, then you can move to your next step, which is a job evaluation. Now, this isn't performance evaluation yet. This is a job evaluation. So you'll take the results of the job analysis for each one of your positions within the organization. And in a job evaluation, you will then compare those positions to each other for the purpose of classifying those positions and then assigning adequate and equitable compensation to those positions. So that's what we consider to be a job analysis, a comparison of position to position. A job evaluation typically looks at elements of the job, such as the skill required to do the tasks of the job, the amount of responsibility that person has in this position, the amount of effort that is required to be productive in this position, and the working conditions that this individual in this position will be working under. So I provided for you on our Canvas site just kind of a breakdown of those 4 different factors in a job evaluation. And the most common type of job evaluation that we typically use is a job evaluation known as a point factor job evaluation. So let me share that out with you. This is what we have up on our Canvas site. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, with a point factor job evaluation method, what we are going to do is we're going to look at a set of compensable factors, factors that can be compensated, and identify them as a means of determining the worth of each one of these jobs. And so the purpose is, again, to classify the position so we can then assign compensation. So as we said before, typically the compensable factors of a job include the categories of skill, responsibilities, effort, and working conditions. We can break down those 4 factors more specifically in terms of, for the factor of skill, we are looking at things such as the experience that is required in order to be successful in this job, the amount of education and the type of education that's required in order to be successful, and the abilities that the individual must have in order to be successful in the job. And all those things are all elements of this factor known as skill. Then we'll look at the factor of responsibilities. We'll ask the question, how much fiscal responsibility does the incumbent in this position have? So is this someone who manages a budget? Is this someone who constructs a budget? Is this someone who makes budget decisions? Or is this someone who is just spending money the way in which they are told? So how much autonomy, how much responsibility do they have from a fiscal budgetary perspective? Then we'll ask about their supervisory responsibilities. And so, do they have subordinates? If so, how many subordinates do they have, and what types of subordinates have to report to this individual? Then the third factor is the amount of effort. We look at the amount of mental effort, the amount of physical effort. A job that you're sitting behind a desk in a climate controlled office, most of that's going to be mental effort. If you're out there, you're kind of doing the shoveling of the pig ore, like Frederick Taylor told us in Scientific Management, that's going to require a lot of physical effort. And then working conditions. Where does the work occur? Again, is it occurring in a climate controlled office? Is it occurring outside in the elements? What types of hazards will the incumbent face? And so if you're a patrol officer, you're going to face a lot more hazards, a lot more risk to physical harm than if you are a police chief working in the police department itself. Extremes in the environment. And so are you, again, working as someone who's working on the highways, and you're out there on the freeway in the rain or in the snow with cars barreling at you at 70 miles per hour? That's a pretty extreme environment in which you are working in. And so that's a pretty extreme working type of condition. So essentially what you do is with these four different factors, you will weight each of these factors based upon their relative importance. So just, for argument's sake, skill, we might weight at 40%. So we give it a factor of 0.4. Responsibility may be weighted at 20%, so it gets a 0.2. Effort at 20%, it gets a 0.2. Working conditions, 20%, it also gets a 0.2. So it all adds up to 100%. Then for each of your positions, you will then score how that position relates to each one of those factors. And so if you've got a position where, like a police chief position, that requires a great deal of experience and education and ability, then that might be a 10 out of 10. So it's 10 times 0.4, and you get 4 points for skill. Responsibility, they have to put together a budget, they have to manage that budget, they have to supervise the entire police department. Again, 10 out of 10, 10 times 0.2 gives you a score of 2. Amount of effort, it's primarily mental effort as opposed to physical effort. And so you're probably going to score that a little bit lower. Maybe that's going to be about a 6. So 6 times 0.2 is a score of 1.2. Then in working conditions, there's not a whole lot of threat of physical harm. You're working indoors. So it's a less risky type of position than if you were a patrol officer. So it might score low there, might score, we'll say a 0.2, it might score a 2 of 10, multiply 2 times 0.2 gives you a 0.4. Add up all of those numbers, and then you end up with a cumulative total for that position of police chief. Then you would do the same thing for patrol officer. Now, for patrol officer, you'll probably score skill lower than you would for a police chief. So maybe that would be maybe a 4 or a 5. Responsibilities would be lower. That might be maybe a 2 or a 3 for a patrol officer. A lot of physical effort, so that might score higher than the police chief. So that might be a 6 or a 7. Working conditions, that's where you're probably going to score relatively high because of the threat to physical harm. That might be a 9 or a 10. But again, what you're doing is you're weighting each one of these factors, then you are assigning a score to each one of those weighted factors, multiplying it out, adding it up, and then if the police chief position comes out with a final score of 12, which is making this up, and the patrol officer comes out with a final score of 4, then we know the police chief position is going to be placed at a higher level in the position classification system, and then will be obviously compensated at a higher amount of compensation. So that's a basic idea behind what's called a point factor job evaluation method. But the basic idea here is in job evaluation, we are comparing position to position in order to place those positions in our classification system for the ultimate goal of assigning compensation. So that's, again, the information that you are using in order to do this job evaluation. That information is going to come directly from your job analysis. So let's quickly jump back into our slides here, and then we're going to jump out of them and then jump back into them again. So we're kind of jumping around a little bit tonight. But so once you have done your job analysis, you've done your job evaluation, you can use the information you've generated to then put together a job or what's called a position description. Now, most of you who are working in public agencies, even if you're working in a nonprofit agency, you probably have a job description. You have a position description that will detail for you, here are the types of things that you are expected to do on a daily basis and the amount of time that you are spending or percentage of time you're spending on each one of those tasks. Now, this position description may change over time. And so you may find yourself in a position that has evolved over time, where you're starting to do different types of functions that are not within your position description. When you're doing things that are not in your position description, that's called working outside your description. And when you're working outside your description, that is then an indicator that we need to probably go back and reclassify this position because you're doing additional tasks that are not necessarily listed in your position description. So a traditional position description will just list for you, here are the types of things that you're doing and the percentage of time you're spending on those tasks. However, what a lot of organizations have moved toward is they've moved away from traditional position descriptions and have moved toward what we call RODs. That just stands for result-oriented description. So in a result-oriented description, you will, in addition to listing, here are the tasks that are done on a daily basis, here are the percentages of time spent on those tasks, you will then also include performance expectations into that job description. So, say a real simple example is you have a front desk receptionist. So you have someone who is a receptionist at the front desk. That receptionist has the job of greeting people whenever they come into the door and then referring them to the appropriate office. They also have the responsibility for probably answering the phones. And so these are the basic responsibilities for that incumbent in that front desk receptionist position. In a traditional job description, you might just say, well, 50% of the job is, well, we'll say 40% of the job is greeting guests whenever they arrive, coming through the front door. 40% is answering the phones, and 20% is referring people to the appropriate office. And so that makes up 100% of the job. In a results-oriented description, we would then have performance expectations for all three of those tasks. So for greeting people as they come in through the door, the performance expectation might be that you greet every single person every time when they come in the front door. That's a performance expectation. So if you don't greet everyone, someone slips by, then you're not meeting your performance expectation of that task. Maybe in terms of answering the phone, maybe the performance expectation is all calls get answered no later than the second ring. And maybe there's a script that you say every time you answer the phone, and you adhere to that script 100% of the time. That's a performance expectation. Referring people to the appropriate office, refer people to the appropriate office correctly 100% of the time. That's your performance expectation. Obviously, a nice thing about having those expectations in a results-oriented description is it kind of serves as a nice segue between job evaluation, job descriptions, and performance evaluation. So in job evaluation, we are comparing jobs to each other based upon the content of those positions. But we also, obviously, if we want to be effective, if we want to be efficient as an organization, we need to make sure that our employees are being productive and that they are meeting these performance expectations as laid out in their results-oriented description. So we have to evaluate their performance. Performance evaluation is another one of those tasks that you'll be doing in the allocation and evaluation function of human resource management. Now, there are a couple of different ways to tackle performance evaluations. One thing we need to recognize is that there are different types of performance evaluation formats that can be used. They have their advantages, they have their disadvantages. There's really not one best way to evaluate performance. But there are some performance evaluation formats that certainly have some advantages over others. One of the most common types of performance evaluation approaches is what's known as graphic rating. And we've all seen graphic rating before. If you have a performance evaluation that is done on you, you probably have done a graphic rating type of evaluation. If you have completed a survey, then that's probably a graphic rating approach. In a graphic rating approach, we will have like or ordinal response categories like strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So the evaluator will respond to a statement such as the employee is punctual to work, and then strongly agree, neither, disagree, or strongly disagree. The employee always completes tasks on time. And again, that like or ordinal scale. And so that's a graphic rating type of an approach. The nice thing about graphic rating is it's very quick and it's very easy to do. The downside is that you don't get a whole lot of constructive feedback. When we are doing performance evaluations, we want to provide not only summative feedback, but formative feedback as well. Summative feedback is, well, you got 80% of your scores were strongly agree and 20% were agree. That's summative type of feedback. Formative feedback will actually give you feedback that you can use in enhancing your performance in the future. With graphic rating, there's not a whole lot of formative feedback that's being provided. It's good for summative, not very good for formative types of evaluations. Another approach is what's called forced choice. In a forced choice approach, you will say the employee always, and then you'll have forced choices such as arrives at work on time. Another choice could be arrives at work no more than 10 minutes late, arrives to work no more than 20 minutes late, and so on and so on. The evaluator, they'll be forced to then select one of those response categories. And if you have not specified the correct response categories, then you're going to get measurement error. Because if there is a way in which the evaluator wants to respond, but it's not one of the provided categories, they will have to force themselves into one of those provided categories, even though they don't belong there. So that will create a lot of measurement error. A ranking approach is really good if you are trying to assign compensation. So you literally will rank the performance of your employees. So we've got 20 employees, we rank them from 1 to 20. The problem with ranking is the same problem we have with any ordinal measurement scale, is that there's no way to determine the distance between number 1 and number 2, and between number 2 and number 3. Number 2 and number 3 performers may be very, very close to each other, but they lag far behind our number 1 performer. But we don't know that. We just have these basic ranking ordinal categories. An essay approach is good for formative feedback, but it is also subjective. And so if you happen to have an evaluator who writes very well, your essay is probably going to look very nice. If you have one who does not write so well, then your evaluation won't look all that good. So there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of essay. The one that kind of deals well with a lot of these disadvantages is that last approach on the screen called the BARS approach. And BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. So for a behaviorally anchored rating scale example, I've got an example up on our Canvas site, but let me hop out of our share and hop into the example of BARS. So let me share that out. Give it a second for it to percolate. Okay, you should be able to see it now, but this is an example of a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Let me go up to the top of it. So in this behaviorally anchored rating scale, what we will do is we'll have all these different elements that we are evaluating an employee on. So the first element is acceptance of supervision. Willingly accepts and follows instructions given by supervisor in the performance of duties, responds to training and coaching in a constructive manner. So then if you want to exceed expectations, that middle category there, which is the best one, obviously exceeds expectations, you would need to demonstrate exceptional ability to independently complete assigned responsibilities. Never complain about assigned tasks. Improves performance following constructive criticism. Knows and follows all policies set by the supervisor. Then the next level down would be to meet expectations, which is where probably most of the employees would be scored at. The types of behaviors that would lead to a meet expectations ranking: readily accepts and completes assigned responsibilities, attempts to improve performance by following constructive criticism. Again, you see the difference here: attempts to improve performance as opposed to improving performance, which you would have in the exceeds expectations type of ranking. Cooperates willingly with supervisor, follows policies, follows specific instructions. So those are the types of behaviors that would lead to a meet expectation rating. A rating that no one wants: does not meet expectations, complains about assigned tasks, often questions supervisory requests, fails to consistently follow all policies set by the supervisor, becomes upset when constructively criticized, sometimes fails to follow specific instructions. Adaptability and flexibility, and there are 24 of these. We're not going to go through them all. But the second one is adaptability and flexibility. Adapts readily to new situations and changes in the workplace, works well under pressure, learns and functions well under widely different situations and circumstances. To get the exceeds expectations rating, you would have to function effectively under unusually high levels of mental or emotional stress, be capable of assisting other staff with change while maintaining regular personal workload, and to conform to changing demands with a positive attitude and skills. To meet expectations, you readily adjust to new situations, you easily handle a wide variety of tasks, you readily comprehend new job-related information, so on and so on. Does not meet expectations, behaviors such as difficulty adjusting to changes, becoming nervous and upset under normal job stress, loses composure under higher than normal stress levels, lacks patience when dealing with more than one assignment. So you kind of get the idea. It's behaviorally anchored rating scale because you were saying, here are the specific behaviors that will then lead to this specific type of ranking or rating. So the nice thing about bars is that it provides you with, or provides the employee with, a lot of formative feedback. They not only see where they have ranked in terms of exceeding, meeting, or not meeting expectations, but if they have not exhibited these behaviors to exceed expectations, then they should not expect that they're exceeding expectations. So it kind of takes a lot of the mystery out of why you got the rating that you got. And that's the advantage of bars, is that it kind of combines all the advantages of the other approaches together into one approach. Now, that being said, we also need to recognize that these approaches are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that we can use a combination of these approaches and put a combination of approaches together. The goal is to provide as much formative feedback as possible. But the problem is that no one really wants to engage in performance evaluation. Supervisors do not like to engage in performance evaluation because of kind of what we call the fear of playing God, in that they are concerned that there are so many benefits and costs associated with the results of a performance evaluation that they don't want to be responsible for someone not getting picked to be in a management training program. They don't want to be responsible for someone to have a subpar evaluation and then perhaps get disciplined and sanctioned for that subpar evaluation. So the stakes are so high that sometimes supervisors try and shy away from performance evaluation. Employees shy away from performance evaluation as well because of the fear of what we call cognitive dissonance. A lot of employees feel that they are doing a very good job, and so they are anticipating a very positive performance evaluation. Then they get a performance evaluation result that is not exactly what they were expecting. It creates this cognitive dissonance, and then they are very disaffected and they are very unhappy. The way in which you can deal with both of those problems is by involving employees in the performance evaluation process. So if employees are involved in the creation of the performance evaluation itself, if the employee is involved in the creation of that result-oriented description, then you remove a lot of the mystery from the process. And the more they trust the process, the more likely they are to trust the outcome of that process. There's a very good article several years ago that was written by an author named Charles Fox. And Fox titled his author something to the effect of Performance Evaluation, the Keystone of Human Resources. And what he referred to performance evaluation as a keystone. And so when you think about an arch that is constructed of stones, that stone at the very top of the arch, that's what's referred to as the keystone. If you pull that keystone out, the entire arch is going to collapse upon itself. Fox argued if you don't do a good job with performance evaluation, then the entire human resource management process will collapse. And I think he's right. Performance evaluation is kind of this linchpin that holds the management of human resources together. But it's admittedly probably one of the most difficult things that we are going to try and master in the evaluation phase of management of human resources. Now, the results of this performance evaluation need to be used to try and remedy any deficiencies in performance. So if we are dealing with a career civil servant who has career civil service protections and is probably also unionized and has protections from the collective bargaining agreement, if someone is documented as having subpar performance on their evaluation, you cannot just fire that person as you could do in the private sector. In the public sector, you are probably going to have to then offer opportunities for training and development. So you provide them with these opportunities for training and development in order to mitigate these problems with performance. And then after they've had their training and development, then maybe 3 or 4 months down the road, you then conduct another performance evaluation. If the performance is still below expectations, then you would offer more and different training and development opportunities. Then after they have that training and development, you would then evaluate their performance again. If the performance is still subpar, then you would provide more training and development. You kind of get the pattern here. At every stage, you have to document subpar performance. So document subpar performance, then document the efforts to provide the training necessary to help the employee improve their performance, then document subpar performance again, then document more training and development opportunities, and so on and so on. The moral to the story is document, document, document. You can dismiss someone, you can terminate a career civil servant, but only for cause. So you need to show that, yes, the performance has continued to be subpar. There is a pattern of subpar performance, and there have been all these training and development opportunities that have been provided, and they have not made a difference. They have not improved performance. Now, obviously, it's up to the employee to accept those training and development opportunities. If they choose not to accept them and their performance still remains subpar, well, that's documented as well. But you have to document subpar performance, document training and development. And then after you have established this pattern and you have this pattern of subpar performance documented, then you can move to the fourth phase, which is disciplining and sanctioning. Again, it's kind of a misnomer where people say you cannot terminate a career civil servant. You can terminate a career civil servant, but it has to be for cause. And you have to document that cause. Because again, you're dealing with these career civil service protections and government code, and you're also overlaid on top of that dealing with the protections that are afforded in the collective bargaining agreement. But that's the basic idea of the management of human resources, the types of steps you go through, and the types of the strategies that you use in order to get people into your organization who are capable of doing the job, figuring out who does what, and documenting that through a job analysis, job evaluation, and job descriptions, placing your positions in a position classification system to assign equitable compensation, then evaluating the performance of your employees in order to identify situations where you need more training and development, and document all that so that either the person does improve their performance or you have the documented reasons for why that person eventually will be terminated from their position. But again, this is just a really 30,000-foot helicopter view of management of human resources. You'll get into all the details of it when you take your 577 course. You'll go through some examples of job analyses and job evaluations, and you put a lot more, as we call it, flesh on the bones once you get to your 577 course. But clearly, since we said 85 to 90% of our budgets are devoted to human resources, the management of human resources is a very important function in the field of public administration. So it just kind of gives you a little insight into what to expect in 577 human resource management. But we've also talked a lot in this class about the idea of managing not just human beings, but also managing public resources. So as public administrators in our public agencies, we are managing not our money, but we are managing the money of public taxpayer money. That places us as public administrators kind of in this role of a fiduciary type of agent. As a fiduciary, we are managing someone else's money. So we are managing the public's money, which then really heightens the requirements and the expectations for how efficiently and effectively we will manage the public's money. So in any good 500 course, we have to spend some time talking about the management of fiscal resources, how we manage fiscal resources in public organizations. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what a budget is. Even if we haven't dealt with a public budget in our careers, we've dealt with our personal budgets. So we all kind of have a good idea of what a budget is. At its very basic level, a budget is a statement of dollars and cents. It is a statement of here is how much money we plan to spend in the next fiscal year, and this is what we plan to spend our money on. Since we're looking at the upcoming fiscal year, a budget is a very prospective type of document. We're saying this is how we plan to spend our money in the next fiscal year. I think that's very true, and that is what a budget is. However, I would also caution us to think a little deeper about budgets. Not only is this a statement of dollars and cents, but I would argue that a public budget is also a statement of societal priorities. We have limited resources and we have infinite demands. When you have limited resources and you're faced with infinite demands, obviously what you have to do is you have to make decisions. You have to make choices between spending money on this or spending money on this, which means we are going to prioritize all these different ways in which we can spend our money. So a budget really is a statement of societal priorities. And so if you see in that budget that in this fiscal year, we're spending more money on education, then education has become a priority. And that's really a pronouncement of how important education is for that jurisdiction. If you're spending less money on economic development, then that is a lower priority for your budget. So when we start thinking about budgets as statements of societal priorities, I think what we have done is we've really elevated the importance of a budget. And it goes beyond just a statement of dollars and cents. Now it's that statement of societal priorities. There are different types of budgets, and we alluded to this when we talked about our decision-making models. We kind of compared rational comprehensive to incrementalism. I kind of foreshadowed this information in that state and local governments tend to use two different types of budgets. They tend to use what are called operating budgets and what are called capital budgets. An operating budget is a budget that contains the money for the daily operations of that government. So the money you're spending on salaries, money you're spending on benefits, money you're spending on supplies, on utilities, on those types of things to keep the government running, to keep that agency running. Those are the types of expenditures that you find within an operating budget. In operating budgets, we oftentimes use incremental decision making because we can. These are numbers that don't change a lot from one year to the next, so we can just add a small cost of living adjustment, and that then makes for our new operating budget. Capital budgets are there for these long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of capital projects. So things like constructing that aquatic center, constructing that recreation center, building that city hall, building that junior high school. Those are considered to be capital projects. Those capital projects are then found in a separate capital budget. One reason for that is we could be more rational in our decision making with those capital projects when we have a separate budgeting process for making those decisions. Also, if you are going to take a $50 million capital project and put it into your operating budget, it would be impossible for your city to balance its budget. And your city is constitutionally required by the state constitution to run a balanced budget. So you have to balance your revenues and expenditures. Adding a $50 million expenditure means you'll no way in the world you're ever going to be able to balance your budget. So by segregating these projects into a separate capital budget, we can then balance our operating budgets, remain in adherence to the state constitution, while still being able to fund these long lifespan, non-recurring, high price tag types of items. So state and local governments tend to maintain separate capital and operating budgets. The federal government usually does not. The federal government typically uses what's called a unified budget. And so they'll take those capital projects and they will dump them into their overall unified budget. And there are a few reasons why the federal government does that. One reason is the immense scope and magnitude of the federal budget. If you take a $50 million capital project and you drop it into the federal budget, you're not even going to feel it. It's going to really be like a pebble in an ocean. You're not even going to notice that $50 million. In a local government where their entire budget is $150 million, that's an entire 1/3 of their budget, it's going to blow a hole in their budget. Another reason why the federal government doesn't worry too much about putting capital projects in their unified budget is the federal government doesn't worry about its credit rating. State and local governments are very concerned about their credit ratings. If state and local governments do not get a good credit rating, it's going to be next to impossible for them to borrow money for these capital projects. The national government doesn't worry all that much about its credit rating. Now, recently, its credit rating has been reduced. And we saw Standard & Poor's recently reduce the federal government's credit rating because of questions about how poorly the federal government is doing its budgeting. Here we sit on March the 5th, and we still have a stopgap measure in place. And if we do not get agreement on the remaining 6 appropriation bills, then as of March 22nd, we're out of money and the government will shut down. We have been really on the cliff of government shutdown for the majority of the past 10 years. And so these credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch's look at that and they say, that's not a really good indicator of fiscal health. And so they have decreased the federal credit rating. But the federal credit rating is still excellent. And the decrease was from a AAA to a AA plus, which is still higher than just about any other state or local government you're going to find across the country. So they're still not all that concerned about their credit rating. The federal government has the ability to coin money. They control the power of the Treasury. Now, obviously, it's not a good idea to print money in order to get yourself out of a financial crisis. The more money you print, the more money you put into circulation, the more you devalue the value of the dollar, and that's going to lead you to a whole lot of trouble. You just ask countries like Venezuela who've gone down that road. So you really don't want to just print money to get yourself out of fiscal trouble. But when you do have the ability to print money, to coin money, that kind of reassures the markets a little bit at the federal level. So the federal government's not all that concerned about these capital projects. So they just kind of dump them into the unified federal budget, as opposed to maintaining separate operating and capital budgets like we do at the state and local level. So how does the process work in the public sector of putting together a public budget? And there are 4 basic phases in the process of putting a public budget together that are kind of shared across all levels of government. All levels of government go through these processes. They just do it a little bit differently. And so they kind of have their own idiosyncratic differences, but they all follow basically these 4 different phases: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. So we're going to briefly talk about what happens in each one of these 4 phases at the national level, and then kind of draw a corollary to what then happens at the state level in these phases as well. Now, a disclaimer here is that we are only going to kind of use broad brushstrokes to talk about the federal budget process because it is so convoluted and so complex. You not only could teach an entire graduate level course on the national budgeting process, you could probably offer an entire degree program on the national budgeting process. You have people who have served in Congress for decades, people like Mitch McConnell, who has served in the Senate for decades. who will admit that he doesn't know all the details and all the nuances in the national budget process. It is that complex and that convoluted. But we're going to give it a try. And so we're going to just kind of hit some of the highlights. So your first phase of budget preparation at the national level, this is where you are trying to figure out how much money do we have available to spend in the next fiscal year? How much money do we have available to spend in this budget that we are creating? So two basic calculations that you will do is you will create what are called revenue forecasts. You'll forecast how much revenue you think the national government will generate for the next fiscal year. And then you'll also put together what are called expenditure estimates, where you will estimate if we are going to continue our current level of service delivery next year, how much extra would it cost us just to keep our current level of services constant, given increases in inflation and the cost of living? So that's what's called a current service estimate. The two organizations that are mostly involved in budget preparation are the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as OMB, and the Congressional Budget Office, otherwise known as CBO. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is the president's arm in budgeting. The Office of Management and Budget will do its own forecasts and its own estimates. And then the corollary agency at the legislative side of the equation is the Congressional Budget Office, created in the 1970s. Congressional Budget Office also creates forecasts and estimates, but it does it for Congress, whereas OMB does it for the president for the White House. These forecasts and estimates between OMB and CBO are oftentimes wildly different from each other. And they're oftentimes different because different assumptions are being used. And we won't get into a lot of the details, but OMB uses a different, what we call discount rate than CBO does. So oftentimes OMB's projections of revenue tend to be a lot more optimistic than the revenue projections that come out of the Congressional Budget Office. But before we know what money we can spend, we have to know how much money we are going to be able to generate. Now, to compare this to the state of California, the similar agency in the state of California to the Office of Management and Budget is the Department of Finance. So the Department of Finance here in California provides that budget information to the governor's office. The similar situation here in California to the Congressional Budget Office is an organization called the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office. They will put together forecasts and estimates of how much different pieces of legislation will cost. They will put together forecasts of if our sales tax revenue, if our income tax revenue is running ahead of estimates, if it's running behind estimates. A lot of the information comes from the Legislative Analyst Office. But shift back to the national level. So in addition to putting together these forecasts and these estimates, the Office of Management and Budget will also solicit budget requests from all the federal agencies and departments across the federal government. It used to be what was known as Circular A22. They would say, submit your budget request for next fiscal year. So all the agencies and departments would submit their budget requests to OMB. OMB would review those budget requests, would then typically make reductions to those budget requests. And then those reduced budget requests would then be assembled together into the president's budget. That usually happens by the end of January, usually just in time for the president's State of the Union address. Now, this year, the State of the Union address is a little late. State of the Union address is happening this week, the first week of March. Typically, it usually happens the last week of January. The Constitution says that from time to time, the president must essentially update Congress on the State of the Union. That's where the State of the Union requirement comes from. There's no requirement that the president go physically before a joint session of Congress to do it, but that's something that's just become a tradition. But usually the budget is put together before the State of the Union address, and then the president goes to the State of the Union address, and then they will present, here are my priorities for the next fiscal year. At the conclusion of the State of the Union address, the president's budget is then ready to transmit to Congress, and that usually happens in very early February. When the president's budget goes to Congress, we then shift from the preparation phase to the formulation phase. So at the national level, that usually happens in February. Here in the state of California, the governor's budget usually goes to the state legislature sometime in January. So it goes a little bit earlier here in California. But whenever the budget goes to the legislative body, we then shift from preparation into formulation. In the second phase of formulation, this is where the legislature considers the executive budget and will then make changes to the executive budget, and then will pass out their own version of the budget to go back then to the chief executive for the chief executive's signature. At the federal level, what will happen in formulation is when the president's budget goes to Congress, it immediately goes to the budget committees. There is a House Budget Committee and a Senate Budget Committee, and those are the central starting points for the president's budget. Those budget committees in the House and the Senate then have the responsibility for passing what is called a concurrent resolution on the budget. This concurrent resolution on the budget must be passed by the middle of April. And this concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum amount of money that can be spent across all of our programmatic areas. So here's the maximum that can be spent on Health and Human Services. Here's the maximum that can be spent on Department of Defense and military services. Here's the maximum amount that can be spent in Department of Agriculture. So we'll have these maximum spending caps that are placed on each one of our major spending areas. The purpose, obviously, of the resolution is to try and impose some fiscal discipline upon Congress. Then, in formulation, the process shifts to the appropriations committees. There is an appropriations committee in the House and one in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 different subcommittees, each subcommittee working on a different appropriation bill for a different appropriation area. Now, this is where we have to do a little bit of background explanation when we're talking about appropriations. There are two main types of spending in the federal budget. There is discretionary spending and there's mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if a program is a discretionary program and Congress decides we want to cut that program spending by 10%, they can do it. They have direct control over it. That's discretionary type of spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So things such as interest on the national debt. Congress cannot decide we're not going to pay principal and interest payments on debt that we have borrowed. You borrowed the debt, you borrowed the money, you have to pay principal and interest payments on that money. That's beyond the control of Congress. So it's mandatory spending. Think about something like an entitlement program. We talked about entitlement programs when we talked about program evaluation. An entitlement program is a program in which people are legally entitled to those benefits. So if you meet eligibility requirements, you are then legally entitled to the benefits from that program. Since people are legally entitled to those benefits, Congress cannot take those benefits away unless they change eligibility requirements. So think about Social Security. If Congress wants to spend less money on Social Security, it would then have to change the eligibility requirement for receiving Social Security. So increase the retirement age to 72 or 75. If you do that, you make fewer people eligible, and so therefore there are fewer people who are getting Social Security payments. Discretionary spending goes through a process known as appropriations. Appropriation is part of the Constitution. Remember our discussion of the Constitution says before Congress can remove money from the Treasury, Congress must first appropriate those funds. Appropriation just simply means saying how that money is going to be spent. So discretionary money is done through the appropriations process, the passage of 12 separate appropriation bills, one appropriation bill for each area of spending. Mandatory spending does not go through appropriations. Mandatory spending goes through a process known as authorization. And in authorization, that's where you go back and you review eligibility requirements for beneficiaries. You can make changes to eligibility requirements. That all gets done through the authorizations process. For our purposes, though, we're going to focus primarily on appropriations. We're going to focus primarily on discretionary spending. So you've got this House Appropriations Committee and this Senate Appropriations Committee. They have their 12 subcommittees. Each of those subcommittees will then pass out their appropriation bill back up to the Parent Appropriations Committee. Parent Appropriations Committee will then hold hearings and make amendments to that bill they've received from the subcommittee. They will then pass that appropriation bill to then go to the floor of the House. Senate will do the same thing to go to the floor of the Senate. We're not going to get into all the nuances of how the House works in terms of privileged legislation and all that. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing tonight. But just know that when the bill goes to the floor of the House and the bill goes to the floor of the Senate, when it gets passed, those bills must be in uniform version, identical version, before they can go to the president for the president's signature. Typically, the appropriation bills in the House look different than the appropriation bills in the Senate. That's where we tend to have conference committees to try and hammer out the details and try and come to a unified version of that bill. That unified version then goes back to the House floor and the Senate floor for passage, and then will make their way to the president for the president's signature. All of this in formulation that starts in early February is supposed to be done no later than September 30th, because the fiscal year at the federal level begins on October 1st and runs to the following September 30th. So if we have not passed all 12 appropriation bills and they have not been signed by the president, all those unpassed appropriation bills, you cannot spend in those areas once you get to October 1st, because you're into a new fiscal year. You don't have the legal authority to spend that money. So that's when Congress does these things called continuing resolutions. And so, say for instance, Congress passes and the president signs 6 appropriation bills, but there are 6 unsigned appropriation bills that have not yet been passed. In those 6 appropriation areas, Congress will pass a continuing resolution, which will say, we will continue for the next fiscal year funding these programs and these agencies at 80% of what they were funded at last year, and we'll do that for a 2-week period of time. Those continuing resolutions then will expire, usually after about 2 or 3 weeks. Then they have to be reauthorized. You have to have a new continuing resolution, and so on, until you finally get those remaining 6 appropriation bills passed. Now, we are in the first week of March, and we are still trying to get a final agreement on those remaining 6 appropriation bills that should have been passed and signed by the president no later than September 30th. What usually happens in the budgeting process is that we kind of get tired of continuing resolutions. And so what we end up doing is we end up taking all those appropriation bills that have not been approved yet, and we dump them all into this mammoth piece of legislation called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA and OBRA, an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And then we pass that Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, and then we have a budget. The problem is that those Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts are mammoth pieces of legislation. And in order to get a member to sign off on it, we oftentimes then have to put in some incentives into that bill in order to induce that person to vote for it. So we end up spending a whole lot more money than we normally would have to through this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation type of process. But if everything goes the way it's supposed to go, and it never does at the federal level, just to let you know, it never happens this way. But if everything goes the way in which it's supposed to, all the bills will be passed by September 30th and signed by the president on October 1st for the new fiscal year. Here in the state of California, it's a little bit different. We do not have appropriation bills. We have one budget. So we've got one budget bill. That budget bill goes to the state legislature in January. It must then be approved by the state legislature no later than June 15th, so that the governor can sign it by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. So here in California, we have a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year. At the federal level, October 1st to September 30th. We also have a unique feature here in California budgeting known as the May Revise. And when you take the budgeting course, I really don't teach budgeting a lot anymore, but when I did teach budgeting, one of my first Canvas assignments, or at that time it was Beachboard, is I would have students go to take a look at the May Revise and then to discuss the changes in the May revise and those changes that were then being made to the governor's budget. So at about middle of May, we get this May revision or May revise. The May revise is a revision of all the assumptions that the governor's budget was built upon back in January. So the governor's budget is built upon X amount of revenue coming in from sales taxes, X amount of revenue coming in from income taxes. We revisit those assumptions in the middle of May. Sometimes we increase them, sometimes we decrease them. There's a fear here in the state of California because we're staring at about a $50 billion budget deficit that when the May revise hits in May, that it's going to be even worse. And that collections of income and sales taxes will lag behind even what we think they're going to be now, and that more cuts will have to be made to the governor's budget. But the budget proposal gets revised as a result of that May revise. Then you have the state legislature approve it by June 15th for the signature by the governor. Now, we have a much easier time getting budgets done here in California than they do at the national level. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is unified government. So here in California, we have supermajorities on the Democratic side in both the Assembly as well as the state Senate. In the state Senate, 32 out of 40 members are Democrats, so there are only 8 Republicans in the state Senate. In the state Assembly, I believe it's 62 Democrats and only 18 Republicans. So you have super majorities in both of those houses, which makes it very easy then to pass that budget. And that budget's then going to a Democratic governor. And so that unified government makes it much easier to pass a budget on time. Another reason why it's easier to pass a budget on time is we made a change to the way in which the budget process works a few years ago. In the past, in order to pass a budget to the state legislature, you need to have a 2/3 majority of both bodies of the state legislature. Now you only need a simple majority. So that makes it much easier to pass the budget. You still need a 2/3 majority for revenue increases. So if you want to increase taxes, you're still going to have to get a 2/3 majority to increase taxes. But again, with the Democratic dominance of both of the bodies of the state legislature, it's not all that difficult to get a 2/3 majority as compared to trying to do it in a more divided type of government. Then to add another little quirk onto the California budgeting process, when that budget is passed and then signed by the governor, we're not done. We then, throughout the remainder of the summer, while the state legislature is in session, the state legislature will pass what are called trailer bills. Trailer bills here in California will then specify exactly how that money needs to be spent. So all the instructions to local governments in terms of how you spend this money, when you spend the money, on whom you spend the money, all those implementation details will come in the form of these trailer bills that are passed after the budget is already passed. So these are going to happen when the state legislature is in session, and they're not in session a whole lot, but in the summer, but through July, through August, into September, that's when these trailer bills are going to come out. So here in California, local governments oftentimes have to kind of wait until they get these trailer bills before they know how to spend this state appropriated money. But once that new fiscal year begins, we are technically moving from formulation into execution. So at the federal level, the execution phase runs from October 1st to September 30th, in California, July 1st to June 30th. This is where we actually spend the money. This is the fiscal year itself. Then once that fiscal year ends, you then move into the 4th phase, which is evaluation. Evaluation is when we go back and look at how we spent the money. Did we spend it in the legally appropriated ways with financial and legal audits? And then we ask the question, how well did we spend the money? How well did we accomplish our policy goals with the money that we spent by doing performance and management-based audits, as we had talked about last week when we talked about policy analysis and program evaluation. The problem with having these 4 phases in the budgeting process is it makes it very complicated, in that when you are in the formulation process for next fiscal year, you're in the execution phase for this fiscal year, you're in the evaluation phase for last fiscal year, and you're in the preparation phase for 2 fiscal years from now. So you are in basically 4 different phases dealing with 4 different fiscal years all at the same time, They're just in different stages of the process. So that's what makes budgeting very, very complicated, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level, such as here in California. That's kind of a brief overview of how the budgeting process works. But what do budgets look like? What's a budget document going to look like? That depends upon the budget format that we choose to use. And I think we're probably due for a break. It's 5:25. So let's take our 15-minute break. Let's take a break until 5:40. When we come back at 5:40, we'll continue our discussion with identifying these four main types of budget formats that are commonly used here in the US. I'll talk you through some of the advantages and disadvantages of them. I have links to examples of each of these four budget formats in our Canvas site. We're not going to go through these examples for the sake of time here in this class, but you will go through those examples when you get to PPA 555 public budgeting. So we're going to just kind of deal with it from a more theoretical perspective when we come back from break. So take a break, come back at 5:40, and we'll continue our discussion of the management of fiscal resources. Sorry, my mute did not come off. We are now in the final home stretch of the material that we cover in this course. And so about another 45 minutes or so, and we will be done for the semester with our material. So where we left off with our discussion is we left off our discussion talking about different budget formats, and the way in which a budget looks can differ depending upon the format used by that government. Now, if you've dealt with budgets before, I'm sure you've probably come into contact with the first type of budget format, which is called a line item budget. Sometimes this type of budget, this line item budget, is the type of budget that is very traditional in that we list here is what we are spending the money on, and then here is the amount of money that's being spent on each one of those line items. So it's a kind of an object of expenditure type of budget. Here's the object of expenditure. Here's how much is being spent. So salaries, here's the amount, benefits, here's the amount, so on and so on. That's a traditional type of budget. You'll see line item budgets used a lot by local governments. They're used because they are very simple. They're very easy to construct. The problem with a line item budget is it doesn't provide you a lot of information. And to kind of create a frame of reference for this entire discussion of budget formats, I want to introduce you to an author by the name of Alan Schick. And Alan Schick wrote an article several years ago where he talked about the three main purposes that we can use a public budget for. He says the first purpose we can use a budget for is for the purpose of control. If we want to control how much money we are spending and what we are spending that money on, then we can use something like a line item type of budget. A second purpose that we can use a budget for is to use the budget document for managing the operations of the organization. So we'll use the budget to better manage the operations of our public agency. And the third purpose is what he calls the planning purpose. So we can use the budget as a planning tool to help us plan out the operations of our organization, to see how all the different units and all the different departments in our organization work together to accomplish programmatic goals and programmatic objectives. So the three purposes: control, management, and planning. The line item budget fits perfectly that first purpose of control. We're controlling how much money we're spending and what we're spending that money on. The problem is we don't have any other information than that. So it doesn't provide us any information that we would need to better manage our organization, to make our organization more effective and more efficient. We don't have any of that information. So what we do in line item budgeting is we look at how much money we spent last year. We'll then make an incremental small change to that amount, and that will then be what we spend for the next fiscal year. Again, governments use it because it's very simple, very quick, and easy to do. A second budgeting format is what's called a performance-based budget. Performance-based budgets will contribute to the management function of a budget document. A performance-based budget will then give us the information that we need to better manage the operations of our organization. So in a performance-based budget, we will incorporate performance indicators into that budget document. So we'll include indicators such as, the example I always used to use in budgeting was a snow removal program, which doesn't apply a lot to us unless we're up in the mountains, but a snow removal program. So that snow removal program, the money that's being spent by that program is going to be spent on things such as plowing of streets. That's an activity that we are spending money on. When we plow those streets, we can measure that in terms of the number of lane miles that are being plowed. That's kind of the activity, and that's the output. So we're plowing these streets, the number of miles of road that we are clearing, that's the output that we are creating by the activity of plowing the streets. The outcome, the consequence of that could be fewer accidents in which snow is a contributing factor. So if the streets are clear, you're going to have fewer snow related accidents. So in a performance-based budget, we are basically tying together the inputs, the money we're spending, with the activities we're spending that money on, with the products and services that are being created by those activities, with the outcomes, the consequences of those outputs of those products and services. So it kind of shows us that connective tissue between inputs and outcomes. And that's what we get from a performance-based type of budget. It gives us the information we need in order to manage how well we are spending our money. Now, performance-based budgeting was very popular at the local level of government in the 1950s with what was known as classical performance-based budgeting. Classical performance-based budgeting looked at the relationship between the money we're spending, the activities we're funding, and then the products and services that we are creating. So it kind of stopped with outputs. Then for a couple of decades, performance-based budgeting kind of fell into disrepute and wasn't used a whole lot by governments. Then there was a renaissance for performance-based budgeting in the 1990s in a new approach to performance-based budgeting. And in that new performance-based budgeting, now we're also looking at the consequences, the outcomes of these products and services that we are creating. So you may see performance-based budgeting used in a local government. You may see it used in state government, but again, the majority of local governments tend to just stick with line item traditional budgeting. Then your third budget format is what's called a program-based budget. A program-based budget is used primarily for that third feature, the planning feature of a budget document. It allows us to see how all the different parts of our organization are working together to achieve organizational goals and objectives. Now, a program budget is going to look a lot different than a line item or performance budget. Line item and performance-based budgets are going to be organized according to departments and units. So you'll have a fire department budget. You'll have a police department budget. In program budgeting, the budget is organized according to the program as opposed to the individual department or unit. So you may have a program such as the protection of persons and property. That's the program. Some of the activities done by the police department will contribute to the protection of persons and property. Some of the activities done by the fire department will contribute to protection of persons and property. All those activities that contribute to achieving the goal of protection of persons and property will be budgeted together under that program, irrespective of which department they are occurring in. So in a program-based budget, we don't divide it up according to unit and department. We organize our budget according to the program that is being pursued and the program goals that are trying to be achieved. In a program-based budget, we oftentimes use an approach known as crosswalking. In crosswalking, we'll create a nice little simple table where across the top in the columns, we will list here are the programmatic goals that we are trying to achieve. Then in the rows on the left, we'll then list the expenditures. And then we'll link up this expenditure contributes to program goal number 1. This expenditure contributes to program goal number 2, again, irrespective of which unit or department is spending the money. So that's what's known as a program-based budget. You are very unlikely to see a program-based budget used at the local level. Where we see program-based budgeting used the most is at the federal level in the Department of Defense. Department of Defense started program-based budgeting in the 1960s, and they've been using a variation of it ever since. Then the fourth type of budget you may see used is what's called a zero-based budget. In a zero-based budget, we go back and we re-justify why we are spending the money on these types of programs and activities. So in a zero-based budget, it's a very decentralized kind of bottom-up budgeting process. So it emphasizes this planning feature of a budget document. So what we'll do in zero-based budgeting is we'll look at our organization, and then we'll identify the lowest level in our organization where budget decisions are being made. That lowest level in our organization where decisions are being made is then called a decision unit. Each of those decision units will then put together what we call a series of decision packages. A decision package will present alternate ways of funding something. So, for instance, I think the example I have up on our Canvas site is for a bookmobile. So you'll have a decision package for a bookmobile. And the purpose of the bookmobile is to try and raise circulation rates by getting the books and the materials out to the public. So people who are unable to come to the library branch, they can then go to the bookmobile when it's in their neighborhood. So that's the purpose of the bookmobile. So one alternative funding strategy is to fund the bookmobile at exactly what we funded it at last year. If we funded at what we funded it at last year, we're probably going to serve fewer people this year than last year because costs have gone up. So the cost of insurance may have increased, the cost of maintenance on the bookmobile may have increased, the price of gas certainly has increased. So if we just spend what we did last year, we may serve X number fewer people, and our circulation rates may drop by X percentage. Those are the consequences of maintaining our current funding level. Then another alternative could be funding the bookmobile at 90% of what it was funded at last year. Well, obviously, if we were taking a 10% cut, we're going to serve even fewer people, and we're also going to have even lower circulation rates. Another alternative is a 10% increase, 110% of what it was funded at last year. We'll serve X number more patrons, and we will then increase our circulation rates by this percentage. So there are three different alternatives to funding that bookmobile. And you'll do that with all of your different programs. You'll create different decision packages for all these different programs. Each decision unit may be creating 10 or 50 or 100 decision packages. So it creates a whole lot of paperwork. All these decision packages then get ranked and prioritized at the decision unit level, and then get sent up the organizational chart, and then get re-ranked and reprioritized. Again, it's a very time intensive, very resource intensive type of way of putting together a budget. That's why you're not going to see many, if any, governments use a pure zero-based budgeting process. When governments use zero-based budgeting, they tend to use what's called a modified zero-based budgeting approach. In a modified approach, what they will do is they will say, we're going to take 20% of our budget this year, and we're going to budget it according to zero-based budgeting. The next year we'll take a different 20%, then the next year a different 20%, then the next year a different 20%, and then in year 5, the remaining 20%. So that after 5 years, the entire budget has been subjected to a zero-based budgeting process. That modified zero-based budgeting approach is a little bit more realistic because it saves you a lot of paperwork and it saves you a lot of time and a lot of resources. That being said, I don't know if you're going to find any local government here in Southern California that truly uses zero-based budgeting. It just really is not used very often at the local level. It is used at the state level. And so we do see it in states like Virginia and Georgia and Indiana. So we do see some states use a modified zero-based budgeting approach. You just don't see it a whole lot at the local level because of the time and the expense that's associated with it. But when you get to your budgeting course, you will see more examples of these 4 different types of budget formats, and you'll talk about situations where some will work a little bit better than others. The performance-based budget tends to work really well if you want to assess the performance of your organization. You want to see how well your organization is delivering its services to citizens. Then a performance-based budget with those performance indicators could be very useful for that government. But as with everything else in public administration, there is no one best format to use. It's the format that works most appropriately in a given situation. But again, you'll explore all these a lot more in the budgeting course. If you want to take a look at what they look like, I do have those 4 different examples up on our Canvas site. But we know that before you can spend money in a budget, you must first raise that money. You must generate that revenue. And so governments generate revenue from both tax-based sources as well as non-tax sources of revenue. So we'll start tonight and talk very briefly about tax-based sources of revenue, their advantages and their disadvantages, and then we'll turn our attention to non-tax sources such as user fees and user charges. So the types of tax-based revenue sources that public organizations base their activities upon are things such as property income and sales taxes. We know that property taxes are primarily the domain of local governments. Income taxes are the primary domain of the federal government and some state governments. And then sales taxes are the primary domain of state governments as well as some local governments. Here in the state of California, local governments have access to the property tax. They do not have access to the income tax, but they do have access to what's called the local option sales tax. Now, property taxes tend to be the most hated form of taxation among the public. The reason why property taxes are hated is that they oftentimes hit homeowners all at once in a big property tax bill. So if you don't have your property taxes rolled into escrow in your mortgage, you are going to get 2 bills per year, and they're going to be very large bills for your property taxes. So because of that type of visibility, people oftentimes don't like the property tax a lot. And they also feel the property tax is not a very fair form of taxation. The property tax is what we call an ability to pay type of tax, in that you pay according to your ability, and your ability is defined as the value of your home or your piece of property. So you'll pay property taxes based upon the assessed value of your home. Here in California, because of Proposition 13, we use an approach to the property tax known as the welcome stranger approach. That's actually what's called the welcome stranger approach. It's kind of a pejorative term. Welcome new residents. Here's your big tax bill. That's why it's called welcome stranger. The way in which property tax works here in California, we're not going to get into all the details because we have a very unique approach to using the property tax in California, but essentially the assessed value of your home will be set whenever that home changes hands, whenever that home sells. If you've owned your home for a long time, say you purchased a home for $50,000 back in 1975, Proposition 13 says that if you don't make any major renovations to that home, your assessed value of your property can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. However, if someone buys the identical home next door, but they purchase it in 2024, they may have paid $900,000 for that house. Their assessed value is then set at the purchase price, which was $900,000. So that person who bought the house in 2024 is going to have an exponentially larger property tax bill than the person who purchased their property back in 1975. So there's kind of that inequity that is built into our property tax structure. But again, the property tax is primarily for local governments. Then we have income taxes. Income taxes are also ability to pay taxes, but your ability to pay is defined by your income level. So at the federal level, as well as here in the state of California, we have a graduated marginal income tax system where we have these different marginal tax brackets. So if you are making $300,000 a year as a single individual, you may be in the 32% tax bracket, but you do not have to pay your entire income at the 32% level. You'll pay up to a certain income level at 10%, then a certain income level up to a certain income level, you'll then pay at 15%. Up to a certain income level, you might move up to 22%, and so on and so on. So the income tax is oftentimes favored by voters because it seems to be a little bit fairer of a tax. But the income tax, as an ability to pay tax, is only a fair tax if it is progressive in nature, meaning that people in higher income levels with more of an ability to pay a higher share, a higher percentage of their income in taxation, than people with less of an ability to pay at lower income levels. Then your third type of tax is a different type of tax. It's a sales tax. And a sales tax is a benefits received type of tax. In that we aren't caring about your ability to pay, we care about what you benefits you are getting from consuming this commodity. So you go in there and you purchase a candy bar in the convenience store, you will derive a benefit from consuming that candy bar, so therefore you pay a tax based upon that benefits you receive. If another person doesn't go in and buy that candy bar, they don't pay the tax. So it's a benefits received principle. The problem with the sales tax is it can tend to be highly regressive, meaning that it can have a larger impact on lower income individuals than upper income individuals. And that's because of this thing known as disposable income. So if you are in an upper income level, you have more disposable income, so more income left over after you purchase the staples of life, things such as food and shelter and clothing. Once you purchase all those staples, you then have more money left over than people from lower income brackets. So inherently, it tends to be a very regressive tax that has a bigger impact upon lower as opposed to higher income earners. That is unless you are able to incorporate the right types of commodity exemptions. So if you're able to exempt the staples of life from the sales tax, then you're able to reduce the regressive nature of the tax and make it a little bit more progressive in nature. Again, states use the sales tax. Local governments also have option to have the access to a local option sales tax as well. So those are all taxes. However, there are also non-tax sources of revenue that governments can rely upon. Those are user charges and user fees. User charges are charges that are assigned based upon the consumption of some type of a service. So you think about utilities, your electrical service. So the more electricity you use, the higher you pay in your user charge for that electricity. So the charge is indexed to the amount that you are using in terms of that service. So user charges are linked to some type of a service. User fees are not linked to a service. User fees are usually associated with purchasing a license to allow you to participate in a certain type of activity. So if you want to drive your car on the road, you have to pay a registration fee for your car. You have to pay a fee to get a driver's license. If you want to hunt, you want to fish, you have to get a hunting license or a fishing license and pay a fee for those licenses. If you want to open up a franchise in a jurisdiction, you'll probably have to get a license and pay a franchise fee for the privilege of running that business in that jurisdiction. That's what's referred to as a user fee. On a practical level, though, a lot of local governments do not differentiate between charges and fees, and they'll kind of put them all together into the same category, even though they are fundamentally different. Here in California, subsequent to the passage of the Proposition 13 in 1978, local governments shifted their reliance from the property tax to these non-tax sources of revenue. So much so that today, the average city here in the state of California derives a higher percentage of its revenue from non-tax revenue sources than it does from the property tax. And that's for the average city in California. Now, cities here in Southern California are a little bit different. And if you look at the average city in Southern California, the average city still gets more property tax revenue, private percentage from property tax revenue, than it derives from non-tax revenue sources. But that's here in Southern California. Statewide, non-tax revenue sources really took the place of property taxes. And the reason for that is that Proposition 13 reduced the overall amount of property tax revenue that local governments could generate. So if they were limited in property tax revenue, they had to get another source of revenue somewhere. So they moved more to a reliance on user charges and user fees. But we need to have adequate amounts of revenue that come into government in order to make those expenditures that we want to make in our budget. If our revenues do not equal our expenditures, then we're involved in what's called deficit spending. A deficit is an imbalance in revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. That's what a deficit is. So it's looking at one given fiscal year. If revenues are less than expenditures, then you have what's called an operating deficit. The federal government has run deficits every single fiscal year since 1969, with the exception of the years 2000 and 2001, at the very end of the Clinton administration. Then we had the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in 2001, the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our expenditures shot up through the roof. And as expenditures went up, then we fell into deficit spending again, and we have been in deficit spending ever since. The accumulation of all those annual deficits will then add up to contribute to what's called your debt. The debt is long-term in nature. So debt could be comprised of accumulation of all these annual operating deficits, plus the capital expenditures that you are making in order to pay for these capital projects. So when we build schools, reconstruct highways, we build city halls, we usually do that by issuing debt. So we will borrow money to pay for these very expensive capital projects. That debt is then usually considered to be long-term debt. Long-term debt is debt that matures in more than 1 year. So a lot of this debt that we issue, the money we borrow to build a school, will be repaid over 20, 25, or 30 years. That's considered to be long-term debt. And the primary debt mechanism that local governments use for long-term debt is this thing called a bond. So local governments issue these bonds, which means they are borrowing money. When they issue a bond, investors will then purchase that bond, and then the proceeds from the investors pay in order to purchase those proceeds will then come to government to then be used for the construction of that capital project. Now, in order to issue a bond, you need to have a good credit rating as a city. If you don't have a good credit rating, then it's going to be very difficult for you to issue debt, to borrow money, because that money will then become very expensive to borrow. Just like in our personal lives, the better credit score you have, the lower the interest rate, the less that debt will cost you in the long run. So governments will issue this debt. They will sell these bonds to investors. Investors purchase those bonds and then use the proceeds to construct these capital projects. There are different types of bonds that governments will issue. And in your 555 class, you'll get into a lot more specifics about different types of bonds. The three main types of bonds that governments often use that we're going to talk about here tonight briefly are general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and double barrel bonds. The most traditional type of bond that's used by local governments is a general obligation, otherwise known as a GO bond. A general obligation bond pledges the full faith and credit of the government in repaying that debt. So when you are an investor and you're looking for an investment, there is this relationship between risk and reward. The higher the risk that you don't get your money back, the more reward you're going to anticipate in higher interest payments. The less the risk in getting your money back, the lower the reward you will get. So a general obligation bond is a very low risk type of investment because the government's promising its full faith and credit. Full faith and credit means that the government is promising it will use all of its resources at its disposal to repay these investors. So since they're using all their resources, investors feel very confident that they're going to get their money back. And so this is a cheap type of debt for governments to issue because the interest rate in bonds, it's called coupon rate, but the interest rate, the coupon rate is much lower with a general obligation bond than other types of bonds. So one major advantage of general obligation bond is it is cheaper for governments to issue. But there are some drawbacks to general obligation bonds. One drawback of a general obligation bond is that most states will impose a cap on the amount of general obligation bonds that local governments can issue. So if you are bumping up against your cap, you may not be able to issue a general obligation bond. Also, some general obligation bonds will require voter approval. And sometimes they require a supermajority voter approval, that they'll require a 2/3 voter approval in order to issue those general obligation bonds. That can make it difficult to get the voters to agree because whenever you issue these bonds, that means that you're increasing your tax rate in order to repay this debt. So voters oftentimes don't want to support those general obligation bonds. Now, most general obligation bonds here in California require 2/3 voter approval. If you are a school district, you can issue what's called a Proposition 39 bond, which only requires a 55% voter approval. And that's what most school districts do. But if a school district is going to issue a Prop 39 bond and benefit from a lower threshold for voter approval, they also have to create what's called a Citizen Oversight Committee. And the Citizen Oversight Committee will then oversee how those bond proceeds are being spent by that school district and hold that district accountable that they are spending the money in the way in which they are supposed to spend that money. Second type of bond is a revenue bond. Revenue bonds are used primarily if you are building a facility that will generate revenue. So you're going to build a recreation center. That recreation center will then charge membership dues to the people who are using the rec center. You then collect those revenue dues, and then you have that revenue that you can then use to repay the debt. But in a revenue bond, the debt repayment is earmarked with the money that is generated from the facility. If the facility doesn't generate enough money, then the investor does not get their investment back. So this is a much riskier type of investment. As we know, the higher the risk, the higher the expected reward. So interest rates tend to be a lot higher with revenue bonds. You can use a revenue bond if you know that this facility is not only going to generate enough revenue to cover its operation, but will also then generate enough revenue on top of that to repay the debt. Those are the situations where you can use a revenue bond. Disadvantage is that it's a higher interest rate, so it's going to be a lot more expensive. The advantage is it does not count against your state imposed debt cap. So it is external to this general obligation state cap on the amount of debt you can issue. So if you can't issue any more general obligation debt, an alternative could be revenue bonds. And then a combination of those two is what's called a double barrel bond, where part of the issue will be general obligation secured with full faith and credit. Part of the issue will be revenue secured from the revenue that's generated from the facility. That type of debt obviously is going to have a cost that is in between general obligation and revenue bonds. It'll be more expensive than general obligation, but it'll be less expensive than a revenue bond. So the type of bond you select will depend upon the type of facility, the type of project that you want to fund with those bond proceeds. But it is very important that you get a high credit rating in order to save yourself some money in issuing this debt. When you get to 555, you'll talk about more different types of bonds, and you'll talk about the whole process of getting a credit rating for those bonds, all the factors that go into establishing a government's bond rating. You'll talk about all that when you get to public budgeting. So long-term debt will be debt that matures in more than 1 year. So it's a repayment beyond just 1 year. Short-term debt will be debt that matures within 1 year period of time. That short-term debt is usually referred to as notes. And when you get to budgeting, you'll talk about different types of notes beyond our scope here to cover things like variable rate demand obligations, tax-exempt commercial paper, bands, TANs, RANs, all these different types of notes. But notes are used primarily to get a quick influx of money, and then that debt is repaid within the course of 1 year. So a reason why a government might use a note, and the state of California has done this before, is if it has a deficit, it's facing a deficit, and it doesn't have enough money in its rainy day fund to offset that deficit. What the state will do is it'll engage in short-term borrowing. So it'll issue some notes, and those notes will then be secured with future tax payments. So you know you have tax payments coming in at the beginning of the next fiscal year. So you'll issue this tax anticipation note, which will then inflate your revenues to then allow you to balance your budget. And then you'll pay that note off in the beginning of the new fiscal year whenever those tax proceeds come in. That's a common use of short-term type of borrowing. But we know that the federal level, the federal government, Congress, is very much in love with debt. We run deficits every single year, and the national debt gets larger and larger and larger. Here in the state of California, we are technically, according to the Constitution, not allowed to run a budget deficit. And so the way in which we usually offset a budget deficit is either through spending cuts or we go into our reserve, into our rainy day fund, and we pull money out of that reserve, and then we use that to offset the deficit. We're going to be doing a lot of that this year here in the state of California. So, one of the problems with the budgeting process, especially at the federal level, is that it is out of control. And it's out of control in a couple of different ways. One way it's out of control is that we continue every year to run deficit after deficit after deficit. Another way it's out of control is we never get the budget done on time. We never get those appropriation bills passed by September 30th. It just simply does not happen. And it hasn't happened for a very long period of time. So, for the past several decades, we have tried to reform the budgeting process at the federal level to help us avoid deficits and to get budgets done on time. We're not going to get into a lot of specifics here, but just to kind of highlight it for you. In the decade of the 1970s, the primary reform that we put in place was what was called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to try and get budgets done on time and to get rid of deficits. The way in which Congress wanted to do it is to elevate Congress and to increase its power in the federal budgeting process. Congress felt that the president had too much power. The president had the Office of Management and Budget. The president got to start the budgeting process. The president got to frame all of the questions throughout the formulation stage of budgeting. When the president's budget went to Congress, it just bounced all over the place. There was no central starting point for the president's budget. So, to reform the process in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, Congress created the Congressional Budget Office to serve as a counterweight to the Office of Management and Budget. It also created these House and Senate budget committees we talked about earlier and required this passage of these resolutions in order to try and impose some fiscal discipline upon Congress. It also tried to limit the president's power in when presidents would decide, well, we're just not going to spend the money. So I've got this appropriation bill. I'll sign this appropriation bill, but I will impound the funds. I will refuse to spend the money. Obviously, Congress didn't like that, and they wanted to try and stop that with the Budget Impoundment Control Act. The Budget Impoundment Control Act was a colossal failure in terms of getting budgets done on time. It was also a colossal failure in terms of avoiding deficits. We continue to run deficits year after year after year after the Budget Impoundment Control Act. Even though the act was a failure at achieving its intended goals, the structure that's created with the House and Senate budget committees, the use of resolutions on the budget, the use of the Congressional Budget Office, those aspects are still in place today in our modern federal budgeting process. So even though the Budget Impoundment Control Act didn't work, it still created the framework that we currently use today. Then the era of the 1980s. In that decade, we turned our attention to deficits. We said we need to get control of these deficits. So we had two pieces of legislation called Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and Graham-Rudman-Hollings 2. One of them in 1985, one in 1987. It's called Graham-Rudman-Hollings because of the three co-authors, Phil Graham from the state of Texas, Warren Rudman from the state of New Hampshire, and Fritz Hollings from the state of South Carolina. Essentially, you had a Republican, an Independent, and a Democrat. So it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. And what it did is it established maximum deficit targets for each year into the future. So it put together a timetable. So it said, next year, here's the maximum deficit we will allow. Then the year after that, the maximum allowable deficit will be lower, and then lower the year after that, and so on, until after a number of years, the maximum deficit we will allow will be $0. So it will eliminate deficits. It did not eliminate deficits. Instead of deficits going down, we'll do it this way. Instead of deficits going down, deficits ended up going up. And the reason for that is because Congress could just simply ignore the law. Congress passed the law, Congress ignored the law. So it just continued to revise these deficit targets year after year. So then fast forward in the 1990s. In the 90s, we decided instead of looking strictly at deficits, we should instead focus on the root cause of deficits, which is runaway spending. So we had this Budget Enforcement Act at the beginning of the 90s. The Budget Enforcement Act created three main categories of spending: defense, domestic, and international. And then it created these firewalls between those three categories, meaning that if you wanted to increase domestic spending, you couldn't pay for it by taking money from international. If you want to increase defense spending, you couldn't do it by taking money away from domestic. It also introduced this acronym that we still sometimes use today in Congress, known as PAYGO, which stands for Pay As You Go. Pay as you go means that if you want to increase spending on a program, you have to pay for it by decreasing spending on another program within that same category. Or if you want to start a brand new program, you have to pay for that program by eliminating another program, again, within that same category of spending. You must pay for things as you go. You cannot pay for the creation of these new programs by borrowing money. It was kind of a sound idea, and the Budget Enforcement Act combined with the Balanced Budget Acts throughout the 1990s, combined with the dot-com boom in the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had Silicon Valley just exponentially exploding in terms of these new dot-com companies that were emerging, generating a lot of revenue for the federal government. You had this huge influx of revenue. You then had these limitations upon spending. You combine a great increase in revenue with a reduction in spending, and guess what? You balance your budget. And in 2000 and 2001, we actually balanced the federal budget, at least on paper. But then, as I said, after the 9/11 attacks and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those expenditures once again exploded. The dot-com boom then started to cool, and federal revenue started to go down, and we were right back into deficit spending. The moral of the story with the federal budget process is if you want to get budgets done on time and you want to avoid overspending, you want to avoid deficits, that is more a matter of political willpower than it is procedural changes. You need to have the political willpower to make the difficult spending cuts and the difficult revenue decisions in order to try and eliminate deficits. That's a hard lesson to learn because elected officials, their primary goal is to get reelected, and draconian spending cuts will not help you get reelected. Big increases in taxation will not help you get reelected. Just ask George H.W. Bush. That was one of the primary reasons why he lost reelection in 1992. In 1992, during the campaign, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." I mean, in 1988, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then in the Budget Enforcement Act, there was an increase in taxation. And so that doomed his reelection prospects in 1992. So it's really very much a matter of political willpower, which we just simply lack at the federal level of government. So that's a really quick overview of fiscal resources and the management of fiscal resources here in public administration. But to kind of wrap the entire show up, because I know we're running out of time tonight, and I want to make sure we get through everything. Let me share with you a couple of brief slides looking at the future of public administration, the future of the public sector. Some of the challenges that we can anticipate facing in the future, and then some of the opportunities that we can also benefit from as well. So, in terms of some of the challenges for the future of public administration, one challenge is obviously going to be fewer resources. We see that here in California with our current budget deficit. What has happened for a lot of state and local governments is that federal COVID money is now gone. They have spent that federal COVID money, and so it's no longer around. And so the actual economic scars, if you will, from COVID are really starting to show. They were masked for a while with the band-aid of federal money. Now that that federal money is gone, now we're starting to see the real impacts of the COVID pandemic. So I think the next few years we'll have fewer resources. We'll be asked to do more with less. A second challenge will be more direct contact. I think that what we are seeing in a lot of our states is more of a call from the public to be more involved in decision making, more calls for openness and transparency. And it's also become much easier for members of the public to contact their elected officials and to contact public administrators. We have so many avenues, electronic avenues for contact, that there's going to be a lot more direct contact between public administrators and elected officials and members of the public. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does slow the process down. So you think about it in terms of things like public record requests here in the state of California. There have been a lot more public record requests of local agencies over the past few years than we've ever seen in the past. Those public record requests, even though they are very legitimate and they should be things that are afforded to the public, they do take a lot of time. They take a lot of money. They take resources in terms of not just staff time to be responsive to these requests, but also legal assistance. And you have to always get legal counsel in terms of how to be responsive to these requests. So I think those requests are going to continue to increase in the future. And that's a challenge that local governments are going to have to face. Less political support. We have talked earlier in this class about the fact that today we oftentimes have elected officials, candidates, who are self funded. And since they are self funded, they're kind of these free agents. And so they're no longer connected to the moorings of political party. And so, as free agents, they are able to expect things from the bureaucracy without providing support for bureaucrats. So, I think bureaucrats and public administrators are going to have to go out there and build their own constituencies and build their own resource of support because it's not going to come to them from political parties and from elected officials. And then the challenge of information, the plethora of information due to social media, due to all these other media outlets, we are inundated with information. We as public administrators need to learn to be intelligent consumers of that information, to make sure that the decisions we are making are decisions that are rooted in verifiable sources of information. We also have to work to help our citizens become more informed consumers of information as well. So I think the more information that we run into in the future, the more important it is that we really look at that information closely to be informed consumers of that information. Some opportunities, related opportunity to that is technology. We know there's kind of this push and pull of technology in terms of technology can pull us in certain directions and push us in other directions. As technology increases, sometimes it makes our jobs easier. So you think about things such as mobile applications, whereby service requests can be submitted by residents through their cell phone. And then there's a GPS locator. So if a citizen sees graffiti on the wall by their house, they can report that through their app. We then have the GPS locator, so we know exactly where it's at. We can go out there and clean up that graffiti. It can really make service delivery a lot more efficient, and a lot more timely, and a lot more effective. You think about things such as generative AI, artificial intelligence, as I told you in our first class session, I really believe is going to have a major impact on public administration in the future. It's something we can't bury our heads in the sand about. It's something we need to embrace. And I think a lot of decision making at all three levels of government will be heavily influenced by things like generative AI. So technology is a real opportunity, but we need to learn how to leverage that technology to become more efficient and more effective. We have 150 years of the study of public administration to draw upon. As we talked about when we talked about the evolution of the theoretical perspectives in public administration, tracing it all the way back to the classical school, we know a lot more today about public organizations and public administration than we knew back in the time of Woodrow Wilson. So we have a better understanding of the problems that we are facing, and we have a better repository of potential solutions to those problems as well. We just need to utilize and leverage that 150 years of study of public administration. Judicial influence. This can be both an opportunity as well as a challenge. We're going to see more judicial activism in terms of the judiciary getting involved in the decision making in the everyday governance in public administration. We've already seen that with judicial outlets, with courts issuing what are called writs of mandamus, orders for public administrators to take certain types of actions. We have seen the use of consent decrees requiring certain actions on the part of public administrators. We have also seen things such as structural remedies, where courts have come in and said, here are specific actions that you must take to remedy some violation of someone's constitutional rights. The judiciary is also revisiting this issue of qualified immunity. We talked about qualified immunity when we talked about accountability and ethics. That traditionally, as public administrators, we enjoyed qualified good faith immunity, meaning if we were operating in good faith within the parameters of our tasks as a public administrator, then we were essentially immune from prosecution as long as we did not violate the constitutional rights of people we come into contact with. That's why we spent our first class session together talking about the Constitution and the impact of the Constitution on public administration. There is a court case right now before the Supreme Court, the Gonzalez case, that is testing this idea of qualified immunity. Usually, when the courts look at qualified immunity, they look at it in terms of a time perspective. So they ask the question, if there was a violation of constitutional rights, was it an instantaneous type of decision? Was it something that had to be decided in the spur of the moment, something that was decided to protect this law enforcement officer or protect this public administrator? Or did public administrators have time to think about it? So there's a case just really quickly from my hometown of Parma, Ohio. It's called Novak versus Parma, where there's an individual who put together a spoof website for the Parma Police Department. So it was just kind of a joke website. And obviously, the Parma Police Department didn't like it. So they went and arrested the person and they put him in jail. And they charged him with a various number of crimes. And they had a long time to kind of think about, is this his constitutional right to put this website up? And so they had a long time to think about it. They had months to think about it. And so oftentimes the courts don't provide as much protection to public administrators if they've had a long time to consider whether or not this is a violation of constitutional rights. But keep an eye on this case called the Gonzalez case in the Supreme Court because it may completely reshape the way in which we look at qualified good faith immunity. And so there's going to be even more judicial influence that we're going to be faced with in public administration. And then the final opportunity is more collaboration. Very seldom today do we have one agency that is delivering one policy or one program. Now we have a multitude of agencies. We have collaborative efforts. We have public-private partnerships. We have public nonprofit partnerships. We have all these different collaborative situations whereby agencies are working together to deliver services to citizens. The more opportunities for collaboration, the more the need to understand how this organization interfaces with its environment. And I think the more collaboration and cooperation we have in public administration, the more emphasis will be placed upon theories such as open systems theory, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where we look at the relationship between the organization and other elements in its external environment. So whenever you look at it through a collaborative framework, whenever you look at it through open systems theory, your study of public administration becomes more complex. And I think in the future, as we continue to study public organizations, our organizations and their relationships become more complicated. So therefore, the methods we use to study those organizations will have to become more complex and more sophisticated as well. But hopefully over the past 7 weeks, what this course has done is it's provided you with a strong foundation for understanding what public administration is, what we study in public administration, differences between public and private sectors, the ethos of public service, if you will, and then some of the specific functions, the specific things that we do as public administrators within the field of public administration. And so hopefully this is a good foundation that you can then use to move into your future courses in the MPA program. So that covers all the material that we typically cover here in PPA 500. So do you have any questions, any observations, any clarifications needed in a few minutes remaining about any of this information that we have covered tonight? Management of human resources, management of fiscal resources, or the future of public service. Hopefully, these past 7 weeks have not discouraged you from continuing in the MPA program. Hopefully, it's encouraged you that you are in the right program. And again, provided you kind of with that basis that you need to be successful in all of your future core and elective courses. Now, again, next Tuesday, we will not have a class. We will not have a live Zoom session. You'll just spend the time working on the final assessment if it's not completed by then. If you have any questions on that final assessment between now and then, always reach out to me. I'm always available. even when this class is over, if you have any questions about the program or anything at all, I'm always available by email. I'm not retiring for probably another decade or decade and a half, so I will be around. So feel free to always reach out to me. Please remember to get Canvas essay number 5 and your responses turned in no later than midnight tonight, and then your final assessment turned in by midnight next Tuesday. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure working with you. It's been a pleasure reading your work. Your essays have been outstanding. Your midterm assessments were outstanding. And I'm sure that your final assessment will be outstanding as well. Take care. Have a great week. And I look forward to reading your work. So take care, everyone. Thank you so much.